An ancient Roman festival which involved sheep, fire, and jumping? Yep, it happened. One of the things I find really interesting in antiquity are festivals. I think festivals are fascinating for a number of reasons. Perhaps the two main reasons being is A, you get a sense of the culture because what's important and what goes on in that festival is obviously really important to the people. And secondly, and perhaps more importantly, the people themselves. When you have a festival, very often you've got the average person celebrating it or interacting with it in some way. So you get a sense of how people were, what they did. And there's some really interesting ones. I mean, my favorite, or possibly my favorite Greek festival, is the Halloween, one that I could never have gone to because it was an all-woman festival. It was in honor of Demeter. And essentially, it was an all-night party, a feast where women ate rude-shaped pastries, told rude jokes, and in fact used obscene language. That was actually something they were required to do. So we get these really interesting festivals in antiquity, and the Parilia was one of them. The Parilia was in honor of the deity Pales. Now, it's unclear whether Pales was male or female. Perhaps it really didn't matter because they were the deity associated with shepherds. And again, we might think shepherds, Rome, you don't immediately think of that kind of a thing. However, agriculture was hugely important in antiquity. I mean, the simple fact was that Rome doesn't get to be what Rome becomes if it can't create an agricultural surplus. And therefore, anything to do with agriculture historically would have been very important to Rome. Now, Pales was this ancient deity. And if we think about how Rome developed, and if we think about some of the myths involving shepherds, things start, well, falling into place a bit. So consider Romulus and Remus. They were raised by a shepherd after the she-wolf had done her thing. And also Romulus and Remus became shepherds for a while. In fact, shepherds are often around and about in the regal period, that is the mythic period where Rome had kings, or is said to have had kings, and not always good. Shepherds weren't always well behaved, I should add, certainly not in the regal period. But anyway, coming to the Parilia, how did it manifest? What went on? Well, first of all, there was a festival that took place actually in Rome, but there would have been one that took place outside of Rome, actually in the countryside. And again, that's really, really interesting because it has to be modified for what a shepherd can do and what a shepherd can accommodate. So let's begin with what happened right at the break of dawn. This festival was said to have taken place around April the 21st, and the shepherd would get up first thing that morning. And what they'd do is they would sweep the sheepfold. They'd also apparently decorate the sheepfold as well, hung a nice sort of wreath on the gate and make it look as attractive as they could, which I think is a really nice thing. And the sweeping, by the way, that was symbolically purifying the sheep, but it didn't end there. They'd then build a small fire, and they'd use straw, olive branches, and laurel. And this would generate quite a bit of smoke, and they'd leap through the smoke, and that would purify them. And we're also told that the sheep were involved in going through the fire somehow. Now, I don't think they actually would take them through the fire because, well, obvious. But what I think there was something symbolic happened. Perhaps they were driven past it or near to it, so the smoke could kind of purify them. Then it was the turn of Pales. So Pales was probably represented by a simple wooden votive image. This is actually more common than we think. Sometimes, again, we think of every time a deity's worship, you have this hulking, beautiful marble statue or bronze statue. More than often, it was something very basic, sometimes just votive, meaning it didn't actually have to physically represent the deity. It could just stand in the deity's place, as it were. So prayers would be made to Pales, but also Pales would be given offerings such as milk and cakes. Again, simple things, simple fare, because these are shepherds after all. Where milk was offered to Pales, he would also be drunk. And apparently there was a wooden bowl that would be used to drink milk from. And we're also told apparently wine, though that might have been a later thing, because again, what we often find in festivals, particularly in Rome, by the way, is they get layered. New things get grafted onto them. And with wine, it was possible that when the Greeks started doing more of their things, they thought, yeah, this sounds quite good. I like the idea of having a bit of wine involved here. Now, in Rome, the festival occurred on the Palatine Hill, and there it was the jumping through the fire thing. So again, a straw sort of fire. There were other elements added, which I won't go into now because it's not too pleasant. And you'd have people jumping, men and women, by the way, jumping through the fire, and that would purify themselves. And just on that final note about fire being a purification, this is found elsewhere. So there was actually a worship of Apollo Seranus, and that occurred at Mount Soracte, which is apparently near to Rome. And you had the Harpy, Seranus, and these were the wolves of Apollo. These were people who worshipped, or rather priests as it were, who worshipped Apollo in that form. And one of the things that they undertook to doing as part of purification ritual was to walk through sort of charred embers. And again, we have fire here as a sort of purification thing. So we often find this elsewhere as well, and perhaps one informed the other. Anyway, I wouldn't advise you mixing sheep with fire, but hey, I'm pretty sure you're aware of that already. But feel free, if you've got some sheep and you've got a nice sheepfold, why not give it a bit of a decoration? Put some flowers and hung a nice garland on there or wreath somewhere.